My name is Vince Carter, and welcome to the VC3 podcast. This video does not reflect my personal political views, nor does it advocate for or against any political party, ideology, or individual office holder in the U.S. I am not offering my opinions or moral judgments. Every claim, classification, analytical framework used in this video is drawn from independent reporting by journalists, peer-reviewed scholarship by historians and political scientists, and analysis by legal experts. All sources are cited on screen and are linked in the description below. This analysis does not assess President Trump's character or intentions as President of the United States. It does not allege malice, ill will, or unlawful intent. The conclusions presented reflect the cumulative assessment of observable actions and institutional outcomes as evaluated through established academic definitions, not merely personal opinion. The first key element of fascism is populist and anti-democratic foundations. Populism, as defined by Webster's dictionary, is a political movement that represents or claims to represent the interests of ordinary people, especially against the establishment. Populist, authoritarian, and fascist leaders build a people versus elites narrative. Society is divided into pure or real people and corrupt and out-of-touch elites. This framing is used to deliberately create distrust in the opposing political party, in established institutions, and in bureaucracies, and even in experts. If the public is already frustrated or distrustful of the government, even better. Populist leaders exploit that resentment even further. Over time, this creates an environment where only the leader is trusted as the source of truth and the ultimate judge of what is right or wrong. The leader is portrayed as embodying the will of the people, which supposedly makes them wiser than experts, judges, and journalists, or career civil servants, or even the institutions and bureaucracies and institutions are framed as obstacles standing in the way of the people's will. As a result, anyone who challenges the leader is no longer just a political opponent. They are portrayed as challenging the people themselves and easily branded as enemies, radicals, or traitors. An excellent historical example of populism and anti-democratic foundations being used to rise to power is Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany. In post-World War I Germany, a prominent nationalist myth called the stab in the back myth falsely claimed that Germany's military had not been defeated in battle but was betrayed within by internal enemies. According to this myth, an international cabal had infiltrated the civilian government, deliberately undermined the war effort, and forced Germany to accept defeat, despite the army supposedly being capable of continuing to fight. These internal enemies were accused of selling out the nation to foreign powers, imposing the Treaty of Versailles, and enslaving the German people through economic punishment, territorial losses, and national humiliation. Crucially, this narrative absolved the German military leadership and nationalist elites of responsibility. The economic devastation, political instability, and social collapse of the Weimar period were blamed not on war or military miscalculations or authoritarian leadership, but instead on traitors within the nation, which were the Jews, the leftists, and the communists. This myth allowed nationalist movements such as the Nazi Party to redirect public anger away from institutions that actually held power and to scapegoat those groups portrayed as existential enemies. Today, most historians agree that the stab in the back myth destabilized the Weimar democracy to a high degree and that it contributed to the rise of Nazism. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party adopted and amplified this narrative, portraying the Weimar Republic and its leaders as traitors to the true German people. In Mein Kampf and in numerous speeches, he blamed corrupt elites, democratic politicians, socialists, communists, and Jews for the Germans' economic chaos and humiliation, declaring himself the only leader capable of restoring national dignity. After the Night of the Long Knives Purge on 13 July 1934, Hitler addressed the Reichstag to justify extrajudicial killings, labeling opponents as conspirators, asserting that his actions were necessary to protect the nation. He claimed that in that moment, he was the supreme judge and guardian of the German people. Later on, we will discuss the Q conspiracy here in America. I'll discuss it twice in this video. It has elements that remind me of this stab in the back myth that Hitler used to help him secure power. So keep this idea in your hip pocket for later. Let's examine the actions of this administration with all of this in mind, starting with the first subsection, which is the people versus elite narrative. The first example we will cover is the politicalization of the military. President Trump has repeatedly used military settings to inject partisan politics into the armed forces, wittingly or unwittingly, shaping a culture that appears hostile toward the Democratic Party. At West Point, he wore a bright red MAGA hat and launched attacks on DEI, critical race theory, transgender troops, and U.S. allies, turning a military graduation into a political speech. At Naval Station Norfolk, he blamed Democrats for the shutdown and tied service member pay to partisan politics. At Fort Bragg, he attacked political opponents while soldiers in uniform cheered. Later on, it was found that those soldiers were handpicked by the administration for political leanings and appearance. At Guantanamo, he called Democrats radical left lunatics, mocked Democratic officials, and declared the military must confront the enemy within and use American cities as training grounds. Leaders set the tone for the culture beneath them. And since the American Revolution, the U.S. military has been expected to remain apolitical. In 1783, the Continental Army nearly revolted against the new young American government because it had not received pay while fighting in the American Revolution. Lacking food, equipment, and clothing, the Continental Army felt it had endured an unjust burden, and many worried they would be financially ruined at the end of the war. The Continental Army threatened to march on Rhode Island, and Congress demanding that they be paid at the barrel of the gun. General George the Goat Washington stopped the potential military revolt by reaffirming that the army serves the country, not a single party, not a single person, not a personality cult, nor even their own self-interests. George the Goat Washington reminded them of their honor, duty, and commitment to their newly established American principles of freedom and liberty. That if they took this action now, no matter how justified it seemed, they would fundamentally destroy all they had fought and bled to protect before it even made it out of the cradle. From that moment on, American politics would not be decided by military force, but instead by civilian rule of law, thus protecting our liberty and freedom from military rule. Washington exemplified great courage and restraint, as any lesser man, especially for that time, could have used the anger of the military to propel his own selfish goals. A true example for real patriots and presidents henceforth. That tradition has held the military together for 250 years. Legal experts and military professionals warn that these actions undermine the political history long established in the military and conditions hostility towards a single party and loyalty towards the other. This is dragging the military into an us versus them fight. An apolitical military is a core democratic safeguard. When partisan loyalty enters military culture, public trust erodes, recruitment and command suffer, and the chain of allegiance risks shifting away from the Constitution towards a single leader or a single party. Once that shift occurs, restoring neutrality becomes extremely difficult. Historical experience demonstrates that armed forces loyal to a single party or leader are far more likely to be used for repression. Just look across the Pacific at our neighbor China during the Tiananmen Square massacre. The U.S. tradition of constitutional loyalty is not symbolic. It's a critical guardrail protecting civilians from political violence and authoritarian abuse. Some supporters argue that presidents have always spoken politically around troops, or that this is merely Trump's personal style. That defense ignores the institutional role of the commander-in-chief. Once the president steps into the role as commander-in-chief, the president stops being a politician and assumes the role as the leader of our national army, designed to protect and defend the U.S. Constitution and every single American, left or right on the political spectrum, especially those who deeply disagree with the president's political views and actions. That is what the commander-in-chief role calls upon the presidency. Past presidents did not turn military ceremonies into partisan rallies, wear campaign symbols with cadets, handpick politically aligned audiences, or frame a domestic political party, the Democrats, as an internal enemy while addressing uniformed service members and our top generals. The issue is not whether the military supports President Trump. It's that the military is not supposed to support any politician. Its loyalty is to the Constitution alone. When service members begin to view one party as an ally and the other as an enemy, military neutrality collapses, putting our democracy at risk. That's how democracies break and turn into single-party rule at the barrel of a gun. Once that neutrality is gone, the door is wide open for oppression and violence. The next example that we will discuss is demonizing the Democratic Party and its voters. The Trump administration has routinely portrayed the Democratic Party and its voters as radical, dangerous, and solely responsible for political violence, while downplaying or refusing to acknowledge extremism on the right. Following the assassination of Charlie Kirk, both president and vice president escalated rhetoric that framed Democrats as enemies rather than promoting national unity.
It's a long past time for all Americans and the media to confront the fact that violence and murder are the tragic consequence of demonizing those with whom you disagree day after day, year after year, in the most hateful and despicable way possible. For years, those on the radical left have compared wonderful Americans like Charlie to Nazis and the world's worst mass murderers and criminals. This kind of rhetoric is directly responsible for the terrorism that we're seeing in our country today, and it must stop right now. My administration will find each and every one of those who contributed to this atrocity and to other political violence, including the organizations that fund it and support it, as well as those who go after our judges, law enforcement officials, and everyone else who brings order to our country. From the attack on my life in Butler, Pennsylvania last year, which killed a husband and father, to the attacks on ICE agents, to the vicious murder of a healthcare executive in the streets of New York, to the shooting of House Majority Leader Steve Scalise and 3 others, radical left political violence has hurt too many innocent people and taken too many lives.
I really do believe that we can come together in this country. I believe we must. But unity, real unity, can be found only after climbing the mountain of truth. And there are difficult truths we must confront in our country. One truth is that 24% of self-described, quote, very liberals believe it is acceptable to be happy about the death of a political opponent, while only 3% of self-described very conservatives agree. 3% is too many, of course. Another truth is that 26% of young liberals believe political violence is sometimes justified, and only 7% of young conservatives say the same. Again, too high a number. In a country of 330 million people, you can, of course, find one person of a given political persuasion justifying this or that or almost anything. But the data is clear. People on the left are much likelier to defend and celebrate political violence. This is not a both sides problem. If both sides have a problem, one side has a much bigger and malignant problem, and that is the truth we must be told.
Critically, after Rob Reiner's death, someone who Trump viewed as a leftist and had deep disagreements with, the president posted a true social post that at best made fun of Rob Reiner's death and at worst celebrated it. Rob Reiner was a movie director who was politically opposed to the president, who had been stabbed to death in his bed with his wife by his son. What type of message does this send when the president of the United States makes statements like this against his political opponents? What type of message does this send to extremists and loyalists across the country? This rhetoric does more than criticize political opponents. It casts them as threats to the nation itself. Opponents of authoritarianism warn that once political opponents are framed as existential enemies or internal enemies rather than fellow citizens, violence becomes easier to justify. This language normalizes repression, desensitizes the public to political violence, and transforms democratic disagreement into a zero-sum struggle for survival. When a president fuels this mindset, democratic guardrails weaken rapidly. And we saw this in real time after the assassination of Charlie Kirk in the Trump administration's language, where they threw more fuel on the raging fire. Far-right influencers were essentially calling for the purge of the entire political left. Collective punishment instead of holding those directly responsible accountable is becoming the new fad today. Supporters often claim this administration is simply stating the facts about political violence. Yet long-term data contradicts this claim. Before we dive into the long-term data, I want to first address the vice president's claims. First, the VP is correct to reference these YouGov polls as highlighting that the left believes that, quote, political violence can sometimes be justified, unquote, more than Republicans, and that is horrific. Yet, when you reframe the question as things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence to save our country, quote unquote, you see that Republicans have consistently scored significantly higher than Democrats and still do. That is equally as horrific. Interestingly, when you reframe the question from a simple abstract idea to specific actions that are in favor of assault, arson, and murder, both political parties score extremely low with minimal difference. Therefore, if you only look at the poll the VP cites, then you'll come to the conclusion that this is a one-side issue and Democrats are significantly more violent than Republicans. But as we just saw, a holistic view of the data demonstrates that Americans' views on political violence vary significantly depending upon the framing of the question, while on very specific acts of political violence, there's a minimal difference between the two parties. And additionally, this is important here, all of these polls can only measure support for political violence. They do not measure a willingness to commit actual violence. You can be brave on the test and then scared in the streets. Only looking at the actual violent acts committed can we determine which political party has more violent extremists. And there's decades of data on that. For more than 3 decades, right-wing extremist violence has consistently exceeded left-wing violence in the United States. Here is just a few different sources you can check out if you don't believe me. A CSIS 15-year study, a study from Cato from 1975 to present, and data from the Persecution Project. In the description, I have links to 7 or 8 different studies that all come to similar conclusions. Even government reports from the Director of National Intelligence and Department of Homeland Security. I encourage you to explore the links, read the reports, see the data for yourself. Common theme from all of these reports is that right-wing extremism or terrorism, especially white nationalism and white supremacists, has been one of the greatest threats to America for decades, not radical leftists. But hold on. According to a 2025 CSIS study, after nearly 3 decades, left-wing violence has finally surpassed right-wing violence for the first time this year, mostly because right-wing violence has significantly dropped. Regardless, left-wing violence should be called out and addressed. But condemning only one side's violence is not neutrality. It is a narrative construction. A president who excuses violence from one side while condemning the other deepens division and increases the risk of further instability within our country. The next example in this subsection is the deep state and evil bureaucrats. President Trump has repeatedly portrayed career civil servants as a hostile deep state working against the American people. According to Crew, between January 2023 and April 2024, President Trump posted at least 56 times on Truth Social calling for the destruction of the deep state. At rallies, he's described federal workers as corrupt insiders sabotaging the country. And in 2025, in Michigan, President Trump said, after a lifetime of unelected bureaucrats stealing your paychecks, we're telling thousands of corrupt, incompetent, and unnecessary deep state bureaucrats, you're fired. Get the hell out of here. This framing undermines trust in neutral institutions by casting ordinary civil servants, which are analysts, scientists, inspectors, public health officials, as internal enemies. It shifts political conflict away from policy disagreements towards an existential struggle between the people and the supposed eternal elite. By portraying the civil service as corrupt and hostile, this rhetoric justifies purges and loyalty-based replacement under the guise of reform. In populist terms, this is a classic people versus elites framing designed to weaken institutional safeguards. Some supporters claim the deep state is real and that the federal workers actively sabotaging the president. Yet there is no credible evidence supporting this claim. The federal civil service consists of over 2 million employees across hundreds of agencies, hired with a merit-based system and serving under administrations of both parties. No investigation has ever demonstrated a coordinated conspiracy within the civil service. I mean, that doesn't mean that misconduct doesn't occur, that there aren't some people who are trying to stop President Trump's agenda. But existing law already provides mechanisms to address this. Civil servants can be fired for cause if they commit fraud, abuse, or are demonstrably incompetent. Labeling all career professionals as corrupt without evidence is not accountability. It's an old school political tactic that turns neutral institutions into enemies so that replacing experts with loyalists appears justified. We'll return to this idea later because this administration has taken some other actions that also align with this. So, scoring for the subsection. I've scored the subsection as fully observed because the administration consistently frames the political opponents, independent institutions, and the media as corrupt or illegitimate elites, while portraying itself as the sole representative of the people, and seeing to justify government actions across the board. It also undermines institutional checks and delegitimizes opposition. As a result, this category of the populist people versus elites narratives has become a core governing tactic for this government. The next subsection we'll explore is distrust in institutions. What we just discussed about the deep state bureaucrats also carries directly into this next category. This is the right moment to explain the Q conspiracy, which builds on the same people versus the elites narrative or people versus the bureaucrats narrative, and is designed to exploit existing distrust in the U.S. government. Rather than treating institutions as flawed and reformable, it reframes them as fundamentally evil, illegitimate, and controlled by hidden enemies, making compromise impossible and radical action appear as the only solution. The Q conspiracy theory, which also has extreme versions of it, which we'll discuss later on in the Cult of Leaders section, is built on extreme distrust of democratic and professional institutions. It claims that core institutions such as the courts, federal agencies, scientists, journalists, and civil servants are not merely flawed or biased, but secretly controlled by a hidden and corrupt international cabal. In this worldview, institutions are assumed to be illegitimate by default and therefore incapable of reform or accountability. Because of this, evidence itself becomes meaningless. Court rulings, expert analysis, investigations, and media reporting are all dismissed in advance as products of this corruption as part of the deep state. Any information that contradicts the theory, and especially the president, is treated as hostile information that only confirms how deeply the system has been corrupted and infiltrated by this international cabal. Within this framework, President Trump is portrayed as the only figure willing to confront the system from the outside, and he's guided by an anonymous figure known as Q. According to Public Religion Research Institution, PRRI, belief in the core Q claims has grown in recent years from 14% in 2021 to nearly 20% in 2024. That's a whopping 2 out of 10 Americans. This indicates that this form of institutional distrust is not fringe, but embedded within the wide parts of the American population. The growth of the Q conspiracy normalizes the idea that democratic institutions are enemies of the people rather than neutral mechanisms of governance. This moves a portion of the population out of evidence-based political disagreements and into a reality where courts, elections, civil servants, scientists, and journalists are presumed corrupt regardless of their actions, and especially if they contradict the president's narrative or political agenda. Accountability is no longer measured by facts or a process, but instead loyalty to this Q narrative. Once institutions are stripped of legitimacy, democratic guardrails weaken. If courts are assumed to be rigged, rulings no longer matter. If experts are assumed to be liars, then expertise no longer matters. If elections are assumed to be manipulated before they even happen, then outcomes are rejected in advance, just like in 2020 and even to a lesser extent in 2024. In this environment, only the leader's statements are treated as trustworthy, while all institutional checks are framed as obstacles to the truth rather than safeguards of democracy. This dynamic transforms government itself. Disagreement becomes proof of being brainwashed against the president. Independent oversight becomes sabotage against the president. Independent institutions designed to check the power of the presidency are now enemies.
As a result, replacing professional civil servants with loyalists can be framed not as corruption, but as a necessary cleansing of the government, fixing it, draining the swamp. This idea concentrates all truth within a single man, and everything else, no matter how strong the evidence, is that the evil satanic cabal is trying to destroy the president, who is the only person who can save us. Don't worry, we'll cover the satanic part later in the video. This reminds me of a good quote from the book 1984, which warns, "The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and your ears. It was their final and most essential command." The Q conspiracy teaches this logic to its followers by creating distrust in all evidence in advance. Some supporters argue that President Trump has nothing to do with Q because he has not explicitly stated that he believes in it. But explicit endorsement is not required for real-world damage to occur. The conspiracy does not depend on formal approval. It depends on reinforcement of its underlying core ideas, that institutions cannot be trusted and that only President Trump can save us. President Trump has repeatedly described courts, agencies, elections, scientists, journalists, and civil servants as corrupt, fraudulent, and illegitimate. In an environment shaped by Q-style thinking, such statements are interpreted as confirmation of this belief. When the president labels an institution as a hoax, followers who are primed by the Q conspiracy accept that claim immediately. The central issue is that a politically meaningful portion of President Trump's base has adopted this worldview in which institutions are automatically presumed hostile and only the leader is credible. And President Trump understands this dynamic, and it looks like he exploits it. Here are just some of the true social posts President Trump has reposted. This pattern is historically dangerous regardless of whether any conspiracy theory is formally endorsed, because it erodes institutional legitimacy, the foundation of which our democracy rests upon. And it concentrates truth and power in a single leader's hands. The similarities between Q and the post-World War I stab-in-the-back myth are striking. Both reframe national failure as betrayal by internal enemies, absolve nationalist leaders of responsibilities, and teach followers to distrust institutions, experts, and facts in favor of a single figure, bring salvation and restore national greatness. The next example is the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I'll be calling it the BLS. On August 1st, President Donald Trump removed the commissioner of the BLS, following a jobs report that revised estimated employment gains sharply downward. When earlier BLS reports reflected positively on the administration, President Trump publicly praised the data. Once revisions became politically unfavorable, he dismissed the figures as fake, phony, and a hoax, and accused the agency of political bias towards the Democrats. Those claims were undermined by the BLS's own record. The agency had previously issued downward revisions to the Biden-era employment figures prior to the 2024 election, revisions that were politically damaging to Biden, demonstrating that these revisions are not politically biased. Additionally, since 2023, the BLS has made 2 revisions, both upward and downward, of similar amounts, and 4 revisions, both upward and downward, of significant but smaller amounts. Job revisions of this magnitude are rare, but they are a normal part of the process. Besides, independent economists emphasize that the BLS commissioner doesn't personally control or fabricate employment data, that this data is produced through long-standing methods. Following the commissioner's removal, the administration initially sought to install a loyalist replacement, E.J. Antone, who later withdrew amid controversy. This heightened concerns that political loyalty, rather than expertise, even though he did have some expertise, was being prioritized in an institution whose credibility depends on independence. During the subsequent government shutdown, the BLS was unable to collect full consumer price index data or inflation data. And in response, the agency relied on what is called imputation and carry forward methods for missing price components. While they're described as technical adjustments, what the methods did is they recorded 0 month-to-month price changes for some goods, which had the overall impact of lowering the inflation rate. A number of economists criticized this approach as statistically unsound and warned that, in the context of intense political pressure, it risked undermining confidence in official economic statistics. There's no evidence that the BLS made up this data. However, the broader pattern is clear. Unfavorable information is being delegitimized. Experts are being attacked. Leadership is being purged. And methodological norms are being bent under political pressure. Independent statistical agencies are essential to democratic governments. When a president attacks official data only when it becomes politically inconvenient and removes the official responsible for producing it, institutional credibility erodes. This behavior encourages conspiracy thinking, delegitimizes professional expertise, and creates a chilling effect across these agencies where analysts may feel pressure to align their findings and align their data with political preferences. This reminds me of the Soviet Union. When data becomes contingent on loyalty, we stop receiving empirical data and begin to be fed political propaganda. The subsection scoring is that institutional distrust is being actively promoted and reinforced through executive rhetoric and policy choices, encouraging skepticism toward courts, agencies, and independent bodies. However, these institutions continue to operate and retain formal independence despite increasing political pressure from the government. Because erosion is occurring without full collapse, this subsection is scored as partially observed. The next subsection we'll cover is the leader claims exclusive authority to define the will of the people. The first example we'll discuss is President Trump's own rhetoric. In 2016, President Donald Trump declared, "Nobody knows the system better than me. I alone can fix it." Since then, he has consistently framed himself as the sole embodiment of America First and the MAGA movement. In 2025, as polling declined amid scandals and economic weakness, President Trump doubled down, insisting, "MAGA was my idea. I know what MAGA wants more than anybody else."
MAGA folks are not thrilled about this idea of hundreds of thousands of foreign students in the United States. We have about 350,000 Chinese. One point during COVID, you were going to, push to, get them out, but that was pulled back. You've said as many as 600,000 Chinese students could come to the United States. Why, sir, is that a pro-MAGA position when so many American kids want to go to school and there are places not for them, and these universities are getting rich off Chinese money?
Sure. Never said about China, but we do have a lot of people coming in from China. We always have, China and other countries. We also have a massive system of colleges and universities. And if we were to cut that in half, which perhaps makes some people happy, you would have half the colleges in the United States go out of business.
So what?
Well, I think that's a big deal.
Are they fans
you would
of,
have the
fans of the United States?
Yeah, but you would have, as you know, historically, black colleges and universities would all be out of business. You would have a system of colleges and universities would
so
go
we're
down
dependent
the
on
tubes.
China to keep our
No,
university
not China,
system going?
But I think it's good to have. I actually think it's good to have outside countries. Look, I want to be able to get along with the world.
They're not the French. They're the Chinese. They spy on us. They steal our intellectual property.
What, do you think the French are better?
Yeah.
I mean, really? I don't know. I'll tell you, I'm not so sure. We've had a lot of problems with the French. You don't want to cut half of the people, half of the students from all over the world that are coming into our country, destroy our entire university and college system. I don't want to do that.
I wouldn't lose any.
And don't forget, MAGA was my idea. MAGA was nobody else's idea. I know what MAGA wants better than anybody else. And MAGA wants to see our country thrive.
When prominent MAGA allies such as Major Taylor Greene, who I'll call MTG for the rest of this, Rand Paul, and Thomas Massie offered fair criticisms, Trump labeled them as traitors or radical leftists. These episodes illustrate a consistent pattern. President Trump presents himself, not the American voters, institutions, or principles, as the sole legitimate interpreter of the people's will. When a leader claims to be the exclusive voice of the people, legitimacy shifts from the democratic process to personal authority. Disagreement about policy now becomes a personal attack on the leader. Even highly conservative allies such as MTG, Rand Paul, and Thomas Massie, who have consistently voted in line with conservative beliefs and MAGA policies, are treated as enemies when they dissent, demonstrating that loyalty, not ideology, is the standard. In this framework, President Trump does not represent the movement. He replaces it. The people no longer define the leader defines the people. Some supporters may say that President Trump is simply protecting the movement from disloyal politicians or establishment Republicans, or rhinos. But that argument fails when you look at who he attacks. Again, MTG, Rand Paul, and Thomas Massie are not moderates or opportunists. They're some of the most consistently conservative and pro-Trump lawmakers in Congress. If even they are traitors for offering basic criticism, then that standard isn't ideology, it's all about obedience. A real movement is bigger than one man and allows internal debate and disagreement. But President Trump's framing makes loyalty to him more important than loyalty to conservative principles or to the voters who voted him in office. Experts on authoritarianism argue this rhetoric is fundamentally incompatible with democratic norms. It elevates the leader above the movement and above the nation itself. Scoring for this subsection, President Trump has repeated claims that he has exclusive authority to define the will of people through his singular interpretation of MAGA and America First. He's positioning himself as the sole legitimate representative of the national interest. However, our democratic institutions, courts, elections, independent agencies, continue to exist, so he's not in charge of them. And because this assertion of exclusive legitimacy is persistent but not fully realized, this subsection is scored as partially observed. Adding all of these subsections together, we get a total score for this full section of 2.5 out of 4 points, or 62.5%. This is the third highest score by percentage and by raw score. The next element of fascism we will cover is nationalistic and often racist ideology.
This is a 10-episode project, but the core of this analysis is built around 7 elements of fascism. Episode 1 is focused on framework and the underlying model, so you understand exactly how I arrive at my conclusions at the end of this series. Episode 2 lays the foundation by defining fascism and outlining the global regime types we'll be comparing against. Episode 3 through 9 examine one of the 7 core elements, one element per episode, with multiple subsections for each, all evaluated using the same scoring every time. This is the meat and potatoes of the analysis. In the final episode, all of these scores are brought together and we answer the question once and for all: is the United States drifting towards fascism?